I bent down to pick up my purse and found a small black rectangle glued to the metal of my car, like a bad souvenir nobody asked for. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't dramatic, it was the size of a deck of cards, matte black, anonymous the way people who mean to be invisible try to be. For a second, I thought maybe Richard had left me some newfangled parking device. Little gadgets and doodads had been his hobby in retirement, the way some men collect stamps. But Richard wasn't here to explain it. He'd been gone 2 years, and gadgets didn't come with apologies. There was a wrongness about it that made the hair along my forearms stand up like a cat's. I took a breath. I straightened up and did the most unremarkable thing possible. I walked the short distance back to the garage entrance and watched. The semi idled, steel and diesel and a driver who glanced at his phone with the practiced indifference of someone who spends his life overlooking things that aren't his business. The truck's trailer bore a Canada Carrier logo, faded from 1,000 highways. Canada meant Alberta, and Alberta meant the RCMP to me, which meant jurisdiction. I'll be honest, I didn't punch anyone, I didn't confront David or knock on Emma's door and demand answers. There are 2 reasons for that. 1, I've seen how sudden accusations can splinter a family. 2, I'm 63, and being alive has taught me a certain strategic patience. I like to win with evidence, not with volume. So I did something I will confess here, but not instruct anyone else to try. I removed the device and, without theatrics, and certainly without precise instructions you could use to harm someone, placed it where, in my head, it would lead me to more truth than yelling ever had. I did not try to disable it. I did not hide it forever. I misdirected it. The truck pulled out of the lot 50 minutes later. By the next morning, I had a caller from Alberta saying they had a man in custody who claimed he'd been paid to watch me. The voice on the phone identified himself as Sergeant Mitchell Wright of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He didn't sound like a man delighted to be making human beings' lives worse. He sounded like a man who had the unfortunate duty of telling other people what had been done to them by the kind of human beings who arrange their wrongs with invoicing. He said plainly that the man they'd arrested had photographs and notes, that my face appeared in his phone, that he'd admitted to being part of an outfit that coordinated something they called a virtual kidnapping. He used the words carefully, as if they were shards. My ears went quiet, and my kitchen smelled like coffee that had been burned yesterday. Richard used to joke that emergency announcements were better received with a biscuit. I had none. The phone call changed the axis of everything. Finding the little black device under my car was one thing. Having someone with my photograph in a Calgary jail was another. The man they arrested mentioned a name, an initial, actually, DM. He said he had been paid by DM. Mitchell Wright read it off like a sentence and then asked me 2 slow, deliberate questions. Did I know a David Mitchell? And had David recently been paying attention to my finances? David Mitchell was Emma's fiancé. He was, up to that point, a bright smile, an ease with practical things I admired, and a man who had been oddly compassionate about tending to me after Richard died. Too compassionate, as it would turn out. Emma loved him. I had loved Richard more than any of my bones could hold, but I had also tried to love in the measured, stubborn way widows learn to. Protect the people you love without suspending your judgment. Still, the word paid nested like a seed under my skin and began to sprout questions I had not been prepared to ask yet. If you're new to my channel, I should say I was a teacher for 30 years. I retired mostly because my knees started to have opinions about stairs, but I kept the curiosity and the tendency to make lists. After Richard, I learned to manage our investments myself. No heroic mastery, just the polite, steady competence of someone who reads fine print and keeps copies. I had spreadsheets. I had passwords. I had a cabinet full of Richard's old notes, which I reread like letters from a man who believed in small, useful things. That competence is what let me breathe at the RCMP's call without fainting, and it's what made me, uncharacteristically, decide not to call David that morning. Instead, I called Emma and told her, in neutral tones, that an investigation in Canada had found a man with photos. "What man?" she asked. Her voice cracked and then steadied into maternal alarm the way it always did. Emma was practical. She'd inherited that from me, and something else, Richard's insistence on never assuming the worst. But she was also hoping for the best, which made her vulnerable. I asked her to come by. She canceled the Pilates class she loved and drove over with a bag of muffins and that particular look people get when their worlds tilt, but they tried desperately to hold the chandelier steady. We spoke in fragments, facts, names, fragments of sentence, while the muffins smoothed out on the counter. I told Emma about the little black rectangle. I told her about watching the truck. I told her about the RCMP and Mitchell Wright's voice. She cried then, quietly, the way a person does when their protective scaffolding shows 2x4 fractures. Then she said 2 words that broke my heart and sharpened my suspicion. He's always been so helpful. Helpful had been the cloak David wore. He helped with the gutters. He fixed the garbage disposal. He was good with forms. He knew how to set up automatic payments for things I had never heard of. Those things are useful in a partner. They are not a permit to be exploitative. I do not like the idea of telling people not to trust their neighbors. I like teaching them to notice details. That morning, I noticed everything. If you're watching this and you've got a story, drop your town below. Where are you watching from? It helps me feel less alone telling these things. And if this is the kind of tale that pulls at your attention, give this video a like and consider subscribing. It helps keep these stories reaching people who might be listening for the same reason you are. Back to the main course of my life, suspicion. I Googled the device that night, more out of muscle memory than hope. 40 years in a classroom teaches you that answers live somewhere between curiosity and stubbornness. The internet is not kind, but it is informative. It taught me there are devices sold legally for pet tracking and child safety, and those that are sold by shadow men with 2 names and a willingness to follow instructions without asking why. I didn't memorize models. I didn't need to. I learned the concept enough to know that a human being had been following me for reasons that had nothing to do with my grocery list. I also learned a practical thing. I needed professional eyes on this, not because I was too frail to handle it, far from, but because professionals make things admissible in court. No one benefits from a melodrama that looks like vigilante theater when crimes are on the table. So I made 3 calls, one to a private investigator I'd found through a friend, Marcus Webb, former FBI, now very much freelance, and with a particular fondness for old Corvettes, one to Harold Finch, who specializes in forensic accounting for small estates and older clients, and one to Susan Martinez, an attorney I'd never met, but whose name came recommended by a neighbor down the street who ran a book club and always had reliable contacts. Marcus answered in a voice like gravel and coffee. He is the sort of man who smells of library stacks and roadmaps. He arrived 2 days later with a manila folder and a scanner. He listened without expression while I showed him the black rectangle and the photographs the RCMP had sent, screenshots of a man crouched outside my house, the metadata of timestamps I could not parse. He didn't ask whether I thought David had done it. He wanted the facts. Marcus taught me how to make facts speak instead of shouting. Harold Finch wore sweaters like men used to wear when they wanted people to trust their pockets. He flicked through bank statements and spreadsheets with the flat enthusiasm of someone who reads numbers the way other people read novels. He didn't find a smoking gun in the first hour, but he did find a pattern. Small transfers, withdrawals coded as routine payments, and a cluster of charges that looked like someone had been funneling cash into accounts with different names. There were, he said without melodrama, inconsistencies. We would need more time and subpoenas to follow the money trail properly, but his initial estimate floated a number, $37,000. That left a bruise shaped like disbelief on my chest. Susan Martinez arrived with a quiet competence and a notepad. She told me what I already feared. This is the kind of case that looks simple and becomes complex the second you try to prove who pulled the strings. There are confessions, there are payments, there are aliases. There are people who will, if given a chance, say anything to save themselves. Don't go alone, she said, and I realized she meant emotionally and legally. Work with law enforcement. Collect evidence through professionals. Keep your communications documented, which is what we began to do. Marcus started following the threads that led away from the cancers of suburban convenience and into storage units and shell accounts. He found leases and a car rental in a name that wasn't on any of the accounts Harold had seen yet, things that suggested a life built on borrowed identities. Harold dug through months of transfers and found that a handful of payments, utilities, gardening services, had been rerouted, swept past automatic billers, repackaged to look legitimate. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic financial specialist Susan recommended, later told me that fraudsters love the small things because small things build trust. People always ask me, later at talks or on the phone, whether I felt afraid. Fear is a practical emotion. It informs. The first night after the RCMP call, I slept with a lamp on and a cookbook under my head like a talisman. I thought of Richard's hands, calloused from a life of projects and kindness, and how those hands would have been furious on my behalf. I thought of Emma's softness in sleep, and the way she trusts people until the pattern shows otherwise. Fear, in that sense, was not the dominant pulse. Anger was. Betrayal tastes raw and metallic in your mouth, like biting a spoon. We coordinated with Detective Sarah Chen at the Portland Police Department.
Sarah's emails came in short bursts, professional and pragmatic. She told us that the RCMP was cooperating, that the man in custody in Alberta, he would later be identified in court as Vincent Torres, had connections that extended across state lines. She warned us about public statements. She also told us, as gently as someone with the burden of an officer can, that we needed to be methodical. Emotions make for compelling testimony, she typed. They don't always build a case. That warning sat with me. I like a good crescendo. I like a dramatic reveal at dinner with everyone's expressions like postage stamps. But Susan was right. Law enforcement needed a paper trail. Money speaks in ways words sometimes cannot. There were other victims.
Marcus located 2 elderly women who had affairs that looked heartbreakingly identical. Small transfers, false invoices, friendly men who called and called until the loneliness in the other person's voice sounded like an opening. Margaret Wellington, Helen Rodriguez, Janet Pierce, names I learned through sobbed phone calls that Marcus helped arrange, had lost varying sums, and some had been coerced into signing things they didn't understand. No one wanted to be on camera at first. There is a shame code among victims of this kind of con that is cruel and private. But these women, once they realized they were not alone, became the most magnificent company. They shared documents and dates and the peculiar shame that blooms in secrecy and then dies in solidarity. One afternoon, Harold called me at my kitchen table. He spoke in numbers, the way a husband used to give the grocery list, practical, inevitable. "There's $37,000, he repeated, but then he added 2 other words that made my mouth go dry, and pattern. He explained how the transfers were structured to look like routine bills. Landscaping, a subscription, a payment to an LLC with a name so neutral it could have been a library. "It's not spectacular," he said. "That's the point. It's mundane. The fraudster wants you to stop looking." He suggested subpoenas so we could track where the money had gone. Susan was already on it. There was a conversation, tactful, hard, that afternoon between Susan and Detective Chen. "If the man in Alberta talked," Chen said, "and if he named DM, we need confirmation before we proceed publicly." There was also a practical police worry that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with safety. Virtual kidnappings often involve scripts, staged calls, and the threat that someone will be frightened into paying. "We need to know if you're in danger now," Chen said. "We need to know if David has the capacity to engineer a call." I understood the statement as both assessment and instruction. I told her about the little black rectangle and the truck and the RCMP. She said she preferred that I not remove potential evidence again and that I let the professionals handle the chain of custody. I respected that. My decision to move the device felt at once foolish and wise to me. Also, to be clear, I made that choice with the intention of leading the tracker to actual human beings who could be corroborated by law enforcement, and I told the detectives as much. They were understandably cautious about my unilateral action. I did not intend to critique them. I intended to give them information that otherwise might have been more evasive. The arrest in Alberta of Vincent Torres, this is a name you will hear later in court transcripts, yielded a fragment. A man with my photograph, notes, and a phone full of images he'd taken at my curb. He claimed to have been paid by someone called DM.
That fragment arrived at our kitchen table one morning over toast and a newsprint feeling in my hands. The world of aliases unfolded like a map, with parts intentionally blurred. At this point, the narrative forked. One path was immediate confrontation. Another was meticulous construction of a case. I don't recommend the first path to anyone. Confrontation, in my observation, often shifts peril from the criminal to the unprepared. The second path required patience, professionals, and the slow building of a legal net that, if constructed correctly, would catch more than one man. I chose the second. I chose to build. There were costs. Building nets takes money, and money is what was missing in many of the victims' accounts. Marcus's hourly rate, Harold's subpoenas, Susan's retainer. This wasn't a campaign financed by nostalgia or righteous anger. It was a campaign financed by small, practical sacrifices and the conviction that older women, women like me, women like Helen and Margaret, deserve to know their finances will not be rated by charm. Emma sat with me one evening while the rain wrote chords on the roof. She read aloud some of David's text messages. Mundane things turned, how they often do in hindsight, into a montage of small manipulations. "How are you holding up? Don't worry about the forms, I can do it." At the time, she had taken them as comfort. Was it comfort or grooming? The line is thin and often invisible until you look back. Marcus found a storage unit lease and a name that matched one of the shell accounts Harold had flagged. It was the sort of break you hope for in novels and dread in real life. We moved on that information with care. We did not storm the storage unit ourselves. There are good reasons to let police approach physical searches with warrants rather than a nervous homeowner and a PI with a flashlight. Marcus coordinated with Detective Chen and an RCMP contact in Alberta, Sergeant Wright, who agreed in principle to cooperate if we could prove interstate coordination. It felt suddenly like a three-way conversation across agencies and borders, with me somewhere in the middle, trying to be at once calm and unflinching. Once you begin working with professionals, you realize how much of criminal work is paperwork, affidavits, subpoena drafts, asset tracing requests. Boredom and tedium are not romantic, but they are effective. Susan told me, with the kind of directness I'd given to unruly students in a classroom, that patience is an active thing. We build, she said. We don't hope. There were moments of absurdity to offset the weight. Marcus found a receipt for a weekend motel booked under a made-up name, and I imagined the man in Alberta, Vincent, sitting behind a steering wheel somewhere and being mildly bored by the routine.
Human malice, I found, was often clumsy and occasionally very clever. What made it dangerous was that the clever bits were stitched together with a casual cruelty that only made sense when you looked at the system rather than the single human who had been paid to watch. One afternoon, Detective Chen looped me in on a detail that made my stomach drop in a way nothing else had so far. The RCMP had, during interrogation, been told by Vincent that a virtual kidnapping was planned, not a physical abduction, but a simulation designed to frighten and extort. He had photographs, he said, and a script. He said he had been paid by someone he called DM. The RCMP had my photograph. The man in custody had surveillance notes. The possibility that Emma's fiancé had been the one to order these services, it hung over the kitchen like a storm cloud. I called Emma. We held each other over the phone and did the thing daughters and mothers do when the bottom has dropped out. We named every small kindness and tried to see whether they had been bait. The mind, in self-preservation, tends to collect reasons to believe when the world wants otherwise. Emma said she'd never suspected. She also said something I hadn't expected. She admitted she'd been embarrassed that David managed paperwork better than she did. That admission landed soft and heavy in my chest. Shame is a skilled collaborator of fraudsters. The more we peeled back, the more we found things that didn't align. Small transfers here, a check cashed in someone else's name there, a company name that meant nothing until Harold cross-referenced it with a list of shell companies Marcus uncovered. It was like watching a tapestry unravel. Every thread removed revealed another knot. The professionals I'd gathered did not provide theatrical certainty. They offered method. Marcus collected leases and photos. Harold traced money to a handful of accounts. Susan compiled the legal scaffolding. Detective Chen drew on police contacts. At night, I would sit at my kitchen table and look at a folder of documents like a woman assembling a memoir she never asked to write. There were bank printouts with transactions I recognized and ones I did not. There were screenshots of a man outside my house that made my body tense in a way only a survivor of ordinary life can understand. The fury I felt was not about the money only. It was a fury about being seen as a convenient ledger line rather than a person. And then, an escalation. The RCMP provided a transcript fragment to Detective Chen that mentioned the words virtual kidnapping and script. That fragment, small as it was, changed our posture from investigation to potential rescue. Script meant names, and names meant targets. If the plan had proceeded, if a frightened call had arrived at Emma's phone, if someone had said her mother's life hung by a ransom, who would have believed it? How much would she have paid?
I thought of all the women who had told Marcus similar stories over coffee and on shaky phone lines. I thought of Margaret's voice, Helen's stubbornness, Janet's quiet fury. I thought of the communal cost of fraud stitched into the private tragedy of each person's ledger. My next steps would have to be measured and coordinated, and they would have to include law enforcement as the backbone. We moved forward with a series of legal and investigatory maneuvers that, properly described now, feel less cinematic than they did on the kitchen table. Subpoenas were drafted. Bank holds were explored. Marcus surveilled patterns, not people, and reported back in the language of movement. This number increased on Thursdays. This account received transfers after a bill payment cycle. This call originated from a burner phone. He also found something that chilled me, a list of names in one of the manila folders that matched the names of older women in our neighborhood.
The ring had preyed on people who did not have the luxury of being believed quickly. It is easy to be righteous in retelling. It is harder to be precise. So here I will be precise where the record matters. The man arrested in Alberta had named a DM during interrogation. That man had photographs of me, and the RCMP contacted me. That is fact. Everything else was analysis, inference, and the building of a legal strategy. By the time Marcus and Harold and Susan had sent back their first full reports, Emma and I had a pile of evidence that, for the first time since discovering the black device, looked like something that could hold up in court. We had photographs, bank anomalies, witness statements from other victims, and, crucially, a cooperating law enforcement narrative from the RCMP. That cooperation gave us the latitude to set a plan that did not involve me confronting David in a way that might have put Emma or me at risk. I will admit to an impulse in those days that was small and domestic and very human. I wanted my house to be the kind of place where secrets could not hide behind curtains. I rearranged the living room to make space to spread documents out like a breakfast at a messy diner. I kept the windows unromantically bright during the day. I told myself these were practical things. Light discourages skulking. The more practical truth is that rituals like tidying one's space are a way of making a place feel owned again after someone has tried to render it vandalized. We set up meetings with Detective Chen and Sergeant Wright, in which the language grew more technical and less theatrical. There were logistics to consider across borders, and the RCMP insisted on preserving the integrity of their arrests in Alberta before handing anything over. The man in custody had been charged with possession of images and materials that suggested involvement in an ongoing scheme. He had, according to the RCMP's notes, confessed to being paid by someone using the initials DM.
He did not, in those early transcripts, give a full name or a clear chain of custody. That is often how these crimes work, a trust network that believes itself invisible. Assembling a legal case requires resisting temptations, the temptation to announce a suspect to friends and neighbors, the temptation to tweet about the indignity, the temptation to call the man and tell him exactly what you know. Susan's voice cut through all those tempting things, like a mentor who has dealt with fools and with the foolishness of haste. We keep it contained, she said. We build a paper trail. We keep victims safe. Safety is mercurial. It is a law and also an art. Emma took to sleeping at my house some nights, and we would talk underneath blankets about nothing more threatening than the neighbor's cat. We watched nothing on TV that involved crime. We ate reheated casseroles as if normalcy could sit alongside planning. There is a peculiar moral balance in living in pretend normal, while the whole of your resources maneuver in the background. One early morning, after a pile of documents had been faxed and emails exchanged in sterile professionalism, Detective Chen called with news. Vincent Torres in Alberta had been interrogated more fully. He had, under the pressure of being caught, given law enforcement some of the names of other people and mentioned the payments. He had photographs, he had notes. Sergeant Wright from the RCMP added that Vincent had been observed meeting men who were unremarkable to other people, but magnetic to investigators, men who did small favors for money and who cultivated anonymity like a profession. Hearing the word observed makes one realize how dear surveillance is in police work and how heavy the word observation can be for those under it. Marcus summarized what that meant. We had a pattern that connected devices, people, and money, stretched across state and national lines. It is a network. It is a business. It is not chaos. It is choreography. That morning, Susan called to say she had filed affidavits to freeze certain accounts. Harold had confirmed transfer paths into accounts that, while not rich themselves, formed tributaries to accounts in other states. Money likes to move where it can be comfortable and anonymous, Harold said, which sounded to me like a proverb of a sad sort. We were not dealing with a single criminal mind, but with an ecosystem that preyed on loneliness and administrative confusion. We had enough to plan the next phase. We could have announced our suspicions privately to the family and asked Emma to confront David herself. We could have let anger drive the hour. I refused that path out of a mixture of prudence and the painful memory of people who tried to catch criminals with shouts rather than subpoenas. Instead, Susan, Marcus, Detective Chen, Sergeant Wright, Harold, Emma, and I drew up a sequence. We would continue gathering evidence, keep lines of communication open, and prepare for an intervention that would be logged, witnessed, and defensible. There is a loneliness to waiting when you know someone close may be culpable. You feel like an archaeologist who found a bone and now must patiently, painstakingly reveal the skeleton without scattering it. Emma's grief for the man she loved contended with her disbelief. She would sometimes speak aloud to empty rooms, trying to convince herself of David's goodness, even as documents said otherwise. I would sit and listen and not argue. Argument and grief is like putting one more stone on a person already carrying a load. And yet, under all that, something like relief began to grow. Not for the drama,
but because the evidence was aligning into a shape you could actually present to a court. It is a strange sort of comfort. Justice is not the same as closure, but justice makes a ledger. Justice says this was not invisible. Justice says this was not incidental. Justice promised accountability, and accountability would mean others might be spared the slow work of discovery that we had endured. By the time the week tightened like a fist, we had filed initial motions, and Marcus had photographs showing a man outside my home at times that corresponded to other records Marcus had found. Harold had traced the $37,000 into a nest of accounts that, when pulled apart, suggested more victims. Jennifer Walsh had given an initial report that described method rather than motive, the wiring patterns, the timing, the way small transactions look after they have been laundered through inattentive bureaucracy. And then, in the middle of a Tuesday that smelled faintly of rain and printer toner, I received another call from Sergeant Wright. This time his voice was quieter, with virtue worn thin by paperwork and truth. "We've arrested someone else in connection," he told me. "He had your photograph and notes. He named a person using the initials DM who allegedly paid him to surveil certain targets." It is one thing to hold suspicion like a private ache. It is another to have a police officer say, calmly, "He named DM." The words hung in the air like the first clack of a gavel. We had, in that moment, crossed a threshold from private investigation into public law enforcement action. The case had teeth. We were not yet at the table where a jury would decide guilt. That comes later. But we were on a path where names that had once been comfortable in our mouths, David among them, would be subject to cross-examination and legal scrutiny. When I hung up the phone, I had the sudden, odd urge to make a list of soup recipes. You take comfort where you can. The chicken noodle I make is uncontroversial and good.
I will stop here for now, because the next steps, when we decide how to present evidence, when Emma must confront a person she loves, when the legal machine begins to hum more loudly, require a careful telling. There is a time for the table, and there is a time to prepare the tablecloth. What I can say is this: finding that small black rectangle under my car did not just change my day, it changed how we would move forward as a family and as a community. It forced us to replace naive trust with structured action, which is to say, we chose to build a case rather than a collapsing accusation. If you're still with me, I appreciate your attention. In the next part, I'll tell you about how we coordinated the evidence, what Marcus found that made everything look darker than we expected, and how Emma prepared for a conversation that would alter the course of all our lives. Until then, keep your lights on, metaphorically and literally. There is more to come. The next days settled into the rhythm we planned, not dramatic crescendos, but lists. Lists are my prayer when the world has gone off script. We had subpoenas to file, affidavits to sign, and depositions to schedule. We had to be boring in order to be effective. I found an odd comfort in that, like a woman who has finally discovered a good pencil for her grocery list. Marcus delivered the first startling document on a Wednesday, sliding a manila folder across my kitchen table as if it were a casserole, useful, solid, slightly terrifying. Inside were photos and receipts that read like stage directions for something sinister. They were motel receipts booked under assumed names, rental agreements for cars paid in cash, a ledger, handwritten, careless, listing names and what looked like fees. Some entries were abbreviated, 2 initials here, a date there, amounts that looked ordinary until you tracked them out and realized the ordinariness was the scheme's camouflage. "What is that?" Emma asked, peering at the sloppy handwriting. She held the paper as if it might tear. "A ledger," Marcus said, "an accounts book for favors." He did not look triumphant. He looked tired. There were soft lines around his eyes that told me the FBI had once taught him what to expect from human cruelty. The ledger mattered because it showed process. Criminals who build businesses, legal or not, need records. Records create culpability. Records link the person who assigns the work with the person who does the work. Marcus found multiple entries that match payments found in Harold's tracing, small transfers that looked like neighborhood expenses, then larger sums funneled to accounts with names that belonged to Shells. Jennifer Walsh later mapped the transfers into a visual that looked rather like a family tree where the leaves had been planted in different states. The image of the money's path made it easier to explain to a court clerk than paragraphs of description ever would.
Susan argued, correctly, that we should keep the ledger secure and not pass it around at family gatherings like gossip. Chain of custody, she said, in the way teachers say, turn to page 30. We cannot let anything be contested because someone thought it would be cathartic to show up with documents. Her point was simple. Evidence has to be treated like a fragile heirloom if it is to be useful in law. That rule was practical and, in a strange way, emotional. If the papers were kept tidy and numbered, the story wouldn't rely solely on feelings in a courtroom. It would rely on proof. We planned a meeting with Detective Chen and Sergeant Wright to synchronize timelines and avoid stepping on each other. Cross-border cases are, by design, bureaucratic ballets.
Each partner needs to know the choreography. The RCMP was protective of their arrest process in Alberta, which I agreed with. Their investigators had done the legwork to detain Vincent Torres, and handing him over without protocol would jeopardize the case. At the same time, we had to move so that transfer trails and witness statements didn't evaporate. The balance felt like walking with a mug of coffee across ice. You have to move carefully and deliberately. While the legal machines warmed, Marcus provided another finding that tightened the knot. He had traced a burner phone used by the man in Alberta to a call that connected to a number registered in a name we'd seen in one of the shell company records. The shell company name matched an LLC Harold had found receiving funds. It was a small connective tissue, but in a case built on layers of small things, petty accounts, convenient favors, it mattered. People who build networks rarely burn all the bridges, Marcus told me. They step, they mark, and someone else follows the marks. That was not poetry I welcomed. It was an observation I filed under useful but bitter. Emma and I rehearsed the conversation she would have with David. Rehearsed sounds like a melodrama, but what we rehearsed was tone and boundaries. Emma needed to know, in advance, what questions would be asked and what evidence would be shown. She needed to be emotionally prepared to hear denials and to cope if her heart wanted to choose the denials over the documents. I think that is true for anyone asked to confront someone they love. The mind will always offer a softer story first. Preparation is the small kindness that lets you hear the harder story more clearly. On the evening we've decided would be the intervention, what we called in our abandoned kitchen shorthand, the table, we invited family on the pretense of a casual dinner. The table itself was ordinary, mismatched placemats, Emma's favorite candle that smells like lemon and guilt, and my tried-and-true chicken pie, reheated and honest. There was laughter at first. Polly from next door brought her usual barrage of pithy comments, until we finally steered the conversation to the reason they'd come.
We had agreed on roles. Marcus would stand in the corner, visible, so if anything odd happened, someone would see him. Detective Chen would be on call and nearby, but not inside our home. We wanted a measure of privacy for what would be an intimate humiliation. Susan sat in the dining room with me before everyone else arrived and went over the order. Documents would be presented, questions would be asked. No one would block a doorway or call for a scene. Susan's voice had a lighthouse steadiness about it, useful and unmoving. When David arrived, he carried 2 bottles of cheap wine and an easy smile that had been part charm, part tool. He kissed Emma and told me he had something to show me after dinner. This was typical David, handy, eager, helpful. He was also an actor of empathy. His expression had been tuned over months to convey concern at the right decibel. It is always strange to see people you suspect go about normal things, pouring drinks, asking about the roast, like actors doing their lines with repartee. We ate with the sort of small formalities that make strained moments bearable. Someone complimented the pie, someone told a joke. Then, when coffee had been served and the lemon candle guttered, I asked Emma to bring the folder. She did, hands shaking in a way I found both heartbreaking and righteous. Emma sat next to him, and for a beat I watched the look on her face, part pleading, part calculation. You could practically see her brain weighing love against paperwork. Susan opened with a simple statement. We had received information from the RCMP. We had an arrest in Alberta. The man arrested had photographs and surveillance notes. He had named someone with the initials DM. For emphasis, she kept her voice plain. We did not want melodrama. We wanted clarity. Evidence came next. We presented bank statements that Harold had redacted and explained, photographs of a man outside my house, the ledger Marcus had found, and some of the transfers Jennifer had traced. I watched David's face while the documents were passed across the table, like a set of small revelations. He did what many people do when confronted with incriminating facts. He smiled as if confident it would be charming enough to deflect the pilot light of suspicion. Who gave you those? He asked finally, looking at Susan with the casual incredulity of someone asked to explain the weather. Our sources are law enforcement, Susan said. We provided notice to your counsel that the family had concerns. We would prefer this be resolved without police involvement, but if you would prefer law enforcement to handle the questions, that is an option. David's fingers flexed around a coffee cup. There must be some mistake, he said. I take forms, I set up automatic payments. I've done these things for my fiancée because I care about her. You set up payments that were redirected to third-party accounts, Harold said, voice flat. Accounts that do not belong to local vendors.
We've traced transfers from Miss Brennan's accounts to those accounts. You don't have to tell them anything, David said to Emma, the line between protector and accused suddenly very thin. You can trust me. Emma looked at him as if someone had swapped her favorite sweater for a cleverly disguised one-size-fits-all cardigan. Her voice was, for the first time since the internet, clear. Dad taught me to read the fine print, she said. I know how to read schedules. I know how to ask questions. David's response when it came was not immediate. He looked at the documents, then at the faces around the table, then at the doorway, as if calculating an escape route. There was a part of him, small and animal, that wanted to run. There was another part that wanted to charm. He chose neither elegantly. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "I have helped. I've paid for things. I took responsibility for some of her bills because she was grieving. Maybe I signed things on her behalf. I thought I was doing the right thing." "You signed checks into accounts that are not affiliated with any of your listed employers," Harold said, matter of fact. "We subpoenaed these accounts. They have connections to people Vincent Torres knows." David's face hardened. He shifted in his chair. "This is ridiculous," he said. He pushed his chair back as if that might create distance from a truth he hadn't wanted to meet. "I don't want a scene," I said. My voice was quieter than I had expected. The table had the rawness of a family in which the ground had given way, and everyone was trying not to step too loud. "If you have complicating information, tell Susan. If you are being accused, you can answer questions, but do not make threats. None of us want anything violent." He stood then, abruptly, and the motion had an edge to it like a cut. "I'm done being treated like a criminal," he said. He walked toward the kitchen, hands in his pockets, the wine bottle left like a minor prop on the table. Emma reached a hand for his sleeve in the old habitual way of someone who doesn't yet know where the relationship ends. He shrugged it off and walked through the back door. I had a momentary, foolish hope he would come back and say he'd been hired to do paperwork for a friend, that there had been a misunderstanding over an LLC name. He did not come back. Instead, we heard the back gate slam. Marcus was already at the window. He's grabbing his bag. He's heading for the truck. His voice was calm but urgent. Detective Chen, who was in fact only a call away, told us through my phone what to do. "Do not interfere. Let law enforcement execute. Safety first." She asked me to call 911 and tell them he was leaving. I called. The operator asked for details, and I gave them the crooked, small items that add up to truth. A man leaving after being confronted, potential flight risk, suspicion grounded in documents. Officers were dispatched. I told Emma to sit and breathe.
Susan told me, almost as if we were two teachers raising hands with a boisterous class, that if he came onto the property in any threatening way, we should call back and update. The police told us they were en route. Moments later, there were sneakers on the gravel and voices outside that did not belong to our family. The sound of a door slamming again, and then a man's yelp, the short, surprised sound people make when they discover life is less in their control than they had assumed. There were officers in uniforms and one man, David, handcuffed in the yard just past the hydrangeas, looking smaller than he had at the table. "I didn't do anything," he kept saying, the mantra of innocence that usually arrives late and sounds like a scratched record. Detective Chen, arriving with marked detail, kept the sort of professional silence that lists facts and nothing else. The officers read rights and took statements. Someone walked through the house to make sure no immediate safety risk remained. David was arrested on suspicion of multiple counts related to financial exploitation and conspiracy. Those were charges the officers articulated, though I will not pretend every label landed on a neat legal peg that afternoon. The scene felt ugly and public. Neighbors peered through curtains, polite and sacred. My kitchen smelled absurdly like lemon pie and detergent and the sharp scent of exposure. There was afterward a dull, blistering aftermath, statements to give to the police, interviews to request, and the odd pragmatic business of notifying banks and freezing accounts. The police asked whether I wanted press involved. I said no. Publicity felt like a potential weapon in someone else's hands. We preferred documents over sound bites. That was not secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was strategy. We had learned that public accusations could create noise that led to missteps. We wanted clean, defensible evidence. When charges were filed and a grand jury convened, legal words that mean different things in different courthouses, ADA Patricia Hernandez joined the team. Patricia is a prosecutor who likes to be precise and unsentimental about facts. She also, as I learned, has a soft spot for people who have been preyed upon. Her job was to take our messy kitchen table and its documents and translate them into the language of indictment. She did this with a clarity I both admired and feared. Clarity means the system is now the system's problem, not merely ours. The defense's initial strategy, I learned through the legal grapevine and through motions that arrived via Susan's emails, was to portray me as an enabler and a conspirator. Their counsel painted scenarios in which a woman with access to accounts might have been complicit in the transfers, or at least negligent. It was frankly insulting, but also in their tactical world not expected. If you can muddy the shore, people may stop looking at the current. Susan prepared me for this possibility.
"They'll try to pivot to motive," she warned. "They'll ask if you knew. They'll ask if you benefited. Your honesty is your strongest asset.
So when depositions came and I was asked about spreadsheets and signatures and permissions, I answered plainly, yes, I managed our accounts. No, I did not sign checks into accounts that belonged to strangers knowingly. No, I did not profit from transfers. And when asked to explain how I came to move the tracker, I told the truth, that I had moved it because I thought it would lead to proof and because I was trying to avoid a scene that might endanger my daughter. I said what I had done without flourish and without exhortation. Susan had told me to stick to the facts, and the facts were my armor. The trial itself was not a single day of drama, but a sequence of legal theater: subpoenas, witness lists, motions in limine to exclude certain hearsay, and expert testimony about how fraud schemes use small, mundane transactions to hide intent. Jennifer Walsh testified with a calm that made charts look like sad, straightforward stories. She explained in plain language how a string of $50 transfers looked different when stitched together with context, how a $200 transfer could be a lipstick payment or a laundered piece of a larger pattern. Her testimony was practical, not sensational. The jury seemed to appreciate the clarity. People like to see puzzles that can be solved. Marcus testified about the ledger and the receipts, Harold about the transfer paths, and Detective Chen about coordination with the RCMP. Sergeant Wright came in from Alberta via video to explain the circumstances of Vincent Torres' arrest, that he had photographs, that he had surveillance notes, and that he had mentioned the initials DM in an interrogation. I sat through each witness like an audience member at a long play, tense but composed. Emma sat near me and held my hand, small human contact during what felt like a long legal stretch. The prosecution did something I did not fully appreciate until later. They framed the scheme as an exploitation of ordinary trust. Patricia Hernandez did not speak in hyperbole. She said simply that criminals use the mundane to make crimes look like chores. That phrasing, mundane as camouflage, stuck with the jury, I think, because it made the abstract concrete. People understood being baited by useful domesticities, someone helpful with forms, someone offering to take care of bills, someone kind enough to mow the lawn. Those small kindnesses, when weaponized, became a blueprint for theft. The defense tried to place me at the center of a narrative of romantic vulnerability, an old widow handing her accounts to a young fiancé, who then used them for his purposes. They asked whether grief had clouded judgment and whether a woman who trusted could be trusted in court. Their line of questioning felt designed to awaken sympathy for the accused and pity for the accused partner. It was ugly, but again, not expected.
When their strategy moved from sympathy to accusation, when they suggested that I might have been part of a plan or had prior knowledge, the prosecutor countered not with heat, but with documents. They showed bank statements with signature lines, bills that had been toggled, and the ledger entries that matched receipts tied to Vincent Torres. They brought in the RCMP's findings and traced the line from my car's tracker to a man with my photograph to payments that led back to accounts connected to David. At one point, the defense called a witness who tried to suggest I had benefited financially. He was an acquaintance of David's who had seen a transaction and jumped to the wrong conclusion. Under cross-examination, his recollection faltered. Under inspection, his story looked blunted. The prosecution, with gentle but unyielding questions, showed the jury that anecdotes could not outweigh ledgers. Facts, not feeling, mattered. David eventually testified. He chose to speak on his own behalf, and what struck me was not the content of his words, but the way his voice had lost that casual, practiced charm. Under oath, charm is a risky currency. He denied knowingly paying anyone to surveil me. He claimed his actions were about helping Emma manage grief. He admitted to being the conduit for certain transfers, but framed them as administrative mistakes. When asked directly about the ledger and his initials, he tried to deflect, suggesting other names and other reasons. The cross-examination by Patricia Hernandez was steady. She asked for specifics and slides from Harold's tracing. Under that pressure, the defense's narrative frayed. The defense tried a final gambit to suggest I had orchestrated a scene to frame David for reasons of my own. It was an ugly, tired ploy, because the only reason I could imagine framing my future son-in-law would be some kind of melodrama too fantastical to plan. Susan objected to the insinuation with the judicial patience of a teacher dealing with a misbehaving student. The judge sustained some motions, excluded some inflammatory remarks, and instructed the jury to focus on admissible evidence. That instruction felt like a gift. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the waiting was a particular kind of ache. There is a temptation to rehearse outcomes and decide which version of victory you will accept. I did the only remotely sane thing left. I made soup and set out crackers. Food is a useful ritual for absorbing stress.
Emma and I sat in my living room, the folders lined up like soldiers on a mantle, our hands occupied with cheap bowls. The verdict returned the following day. Guilty on multiple counts related to financial exploitation and conspiracy. The jurors looked tired, and I imagined a bit relieved to go home. David's face, when he heard the verdict, crumpled into a complex knot of denial and resignation. He leaned back in his chair and let the weight of the courtroom settle.
To be honest, I felt a small human triumph, a sense that paper could defeat performative charm. But triumph was and should be tempered. A guilty verdict does not erase the harm done, it only acknowledges it. Sentencing came months later in a courthouse that smelled faintly of old coffee and polished wood. The judge spoke about the breach of trust inherent in exploiting someone's grief. He imposed a sentence that, while not dramatic in the world sense, was significant in our community. A term of incarceration coupled with an order for restitution. The restitution would not make the money entirely whole. One never fully recovers the time and dignity drained by betrayal, but it provided a ledger of accountability. A court order might return funds to accounts. It might seize assets. It could not, however, return the quiet of nights without worry, or the way Emma's confidence had been rearranged. Restitution is meant to be practical and not magical. That was an important distinction for me to keep. There were appeals. Of course there were. Defense lawyers are paid to file appeals. We weathered them with the patience of people who have learned to value process. Patricia Hernandez became a steady presence in our lives, not because she needed to be, but because she believed in this case and in the broader need to hold predators responsible. She reminded the court when sentencing came up that these schemes are not just about money, they are about vulnerability exploited for profit. After the legal dust settled sufficiently that we could think clearly, my attorney, Susan, suggested it was time to consider what to do with the residue of experience, the folders, the hurt, the community that had gathered like a net and a rumor at once. "You might want to do something that turns this into a preventative," she said one afternoon, as sunlight made lattices on her office carpet. "Something that helps other people recognize the patterns and where to go for help." The idea lodged and germinated in me. It is a peculiar feeling when pain becomes a task. You can let it eat you, or you can let it be fuel. I chose fuel. With Emma's help, we founded the Clara Brennan Foundation for Elder Financial Protection, an awkwardly formal name for what started as a kitchen table desire to make sure others didn't have to suffer in silence. The foundation's mission is simple: education, resources, and referrals to vetted professionals. We do not give legal advice for free. We connect people to trusted lawyers, forensic accountants, and local law enforcement liaisons. We provide workshops at community centers on red flags and on how to organize financial documents sensibly. We host support groups because shame is a powerful, isolating force, and people who share stories make one another braver. We also partnered with other organizations that help victims of elder fraud.
Emma took on a formal role in the foundation. She runs outreach and is excellent at it, and the work gave her back a piece of herself that had felt stolen. Being active in prevention gave her agency and meaning beyond the wound. She became, in that painful, admirable way, both survivor and advocate. We organized a modest seminar, table folding chairs, cookies burned slightly at the edges, a borrowed projector, and invited neighbors, friends, and those who had once been clients of the fraud ring. Margaret, Helen, Janet, women who had once called in tears, sat in the front row. Some of them would not speak at first, until one of them, an indomitable, sharp-witted woman named Margaret, stood and said, "We are not going to be ashamed anymore." That sentence felt like the true restitution. Money and conviction are one kind of repair. Solidarity is another. Through the foundation, we emphasize practical steps that do not involve acting out of anger. Use professional help, keep transparent records, and involve law enforcement early. We emphasize the emotional reality too. Grief and loneliness are exploited, and community reduces both. Our resources include a list of vetted professionals, a sample checklist for organizing important documents, and guidance on how to talk to family members about finances without creating a fight. We do not, in any circumstance, encourage people to take matters into their own hands if they feel threatened. We always advise contacting police and lawyers first. If my initial act of moving the device was clumsy and unilateral, let it be a cautionary footnote.
Partnership with authorities is the safe road. There were small victories along the way. Some funds were recovered through court-ordered restitution and asset seizures. Not everything was returned, and I will not pretend otherwise. Some of the people who had been involved in the ring were sentenced and are serving time in different jurisdictions. The man in Alberta, Vincent Torres, was prosecuted in his country. His cooperation helped to expose the network. The legal system is imperfect, but it can bite if it's given the evidence and if victims are willing to organize and testify. That step, organizing to testify, is one few people find easy, and it's why we work so hard to create safe places to do it. I tell this story not because I want to be a cautionary tale, but because the experience altered the shape of my ordinary life. There are evenings now when I sit on my couch with a blanket across my knees and think of Richard and of the small rituals we did together. The grief hasn't gone, it rearranged itself, like furniture in a room we both used to know. But the grief no longer has the power to render me trustless. Instead, it has made me precise. I pay attention, not because I fear the world, but because I respect my own resources, a practical reverence for bank statements and forms, and the voice that asks for help.
Friends sometimes say to me with a shake of their heads, "I don't know how you did it." I answer, as truthfully as I can, I did it because I had to. I did it because I did not want other women to be secretly bled by someone who smiles well. I did it because being older and cautious is not an apology, but a strategy. I did it because justice is sometimes slow, and if you can help the machine do its job with clear paperwork and patient testimony, you owe it to the next person. There were costs. Trust that Emma took work to reconstruct, some friendships frayed under the strain of gossip and suspicion. I now get peppered occasionally with strangers asking for legal tips at checkouts, and the house has a new lock by the back gate, small practicalities that speak to the aftermath of breach. But there was also a new life that grew out of the mess, the foundation I never planned, the community of women who now support one another, and the quiet satisfaction that a legal net had finally been built and used. Sometimes I think of the man David had hired, and of the ledger and its clumsy accounts. Human cruelty often wears ordinary shoes. It is not glamorous. It is a ledger of small things, an invoice here, a kindly text there, a check redirected until the sum looks substantial. Those small things add up until they are no longer small. That is the lesson the foundation tries to teach. Notice the small things earlier and get help. At book clubs and community talks, people ask what the single most important thing to do is after discovering suspicious activity. I answer in my mother-teacher way. Document, do not act alone, and find professionals. Don't let shame keep you quiet. Reach out. You are not being tattled on, you are being proactive about your life. And to finish, because storytelling is a loop, find the ordinary comforts and hold them tight. Make your soup. Rearrange a chair. Those small rituals stitch you back together. I sleep with a different rhythm now, not guarded, but organized. I have better filters on my emails, more rigorous account alerts, and a foundation's mailing list that matters more than any trivial newsletter ever will. If you have a story, if something like this has touched your life, please share it below. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you feel comfortable, what happened. These conversations matter. They turn private shame into public resource. If you found this story helpful, consider subscribing so you don't miss the sort of ordinary turned into extraordinary tales we explore here. And in the description, you'll find links to resources and organizations that can help if you or someone you love is facing elder fraud. Those resources are informational and meant to guide you toward vetted professionals and law enforcement contacts in your area. I will say finally that discovering that small black rectangle under my car did change everything, because it forced us to make the invisible visible.
It forced us to turn suspicion into evidence, grief into action, and hurt into a program that might protect someone else. It also taught me an important domestic lesson. Never underestimate the organizing power of a woman who knows how to make lists.